The background of the US-China trade war, leading up to the recent Phase 1 preliminary trade deal. Ever since the 1980s, Trump has been advocating to impose tariffs on foreign countries in order to decrease the US trade deficit, but back then it was directed at Japan rather than China. In the 1980s, the United States became a major importer of Japanese cars and electronics and amassed a large trade deficit with the country. Trump wrote an open letter titled To the American People in 1987. In the letter, Trump rails against the trade deficits and declares that the U.S. should make Japan pay. In 1999, he stated that perhaps there has to be a trade war with Japan in order to fix the trade deficit, showing that he was already a firm believer in the idea of a trade war. On August 14, 2017, Trump orders an investigation into Chinese infringement upon U.S. intellectual property. On March 22, 2018, Trump imposes tariffs on China due to the investigation, concluding that China stole U.S. intellectual property through coercive means such as requiring partnerships with Chinese companies before entering the Chinese market, and setting up programs in the U.S. to recruit top talent from technological hotspots like Silicon Valley. China imposes tariffs on the U.S. in retaliation. From June through September, the U.S. and China continued to impose tariffs on each other. On June 15th, both the U.S. and China imposed a 25% tariff on $50 billion worth of imports on each other. On August 8th, Trump imposed another 25% tariff on $16 billion worth of Chinese goods. China retaliates with the same value of tariffs. On December 1st, China and the U.S. agreed to a 90-day truce to stop imposing tariffs on each other. On December 4th, though, Trump declares that he is a tariff man because China is raiding U.S. wealth. He believes that tariffs will max out U.S. economic power to make America rich again.
At the start of the new year, from January to March, the United States engaged in preliminary trade talks with top Chinese economic advisor Liu He in Washington, D.C. and Beijing. On May 10th, despite the months-long trade talks, Trump declares that new tariffs will be imposed on China because China has attempted to renegotiate the trade deal. China responds by imposing new tariffs on U.S. as well.
Another truce on the trade war is declared on June 26th. Liu He meets with U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer in Shanghai to discuss goodwill gestures such as U.S. easing sanctions on China and China purchasing more U.S. goods.
Despite the trade talks, Trump announced an additional 10% tariffs on $300 billion of imports from China.
In response to the September 1st tariffs, China imposes new tariffs on $75 billion worth of imports from the U.S. On September 19th, though, the U.S. and China hold trade talks in Washington, D.C. The following month, on October 11th, the United States and China reach a preliminary trade deal called Phase 1. It should not be confused for a final signed trade deal agreement between the two countries, though. Phase 1 would delay tariff increases that the U.S. imposed on China, increase Chinese purchases of U.S. agricultural goods, and strengthen intellectual property provisions.
Now we're going to talk about the United States motivations and the Chinese motivations for entering the trade war. President Trump's tariffs are not only against China. The tariffs can also be related to Trump's America First policy to reduce the United States trade deficit. His goal is to shift American economic relations away from multilateral agreements and towards bilateral trade partnerships. Trump has been firmly against Trans-Pacific Partnership as well as NAFTA, both widely supported multilateral trade agreements. In 2018, the U.S.-China trade war began when United States President Donald Trump set tariffs and restrictions against China. President Trump has expressed concern over the unfairness of U.S.-China trade since the 1980s, long before he became the president.
The fact is that you don't have free trade. We think of it as free trade, but you right now don't have free trade. And I think a lot of people are tired of watching other countries ripping off the United States.
The United States government's motivation was to get China to change what President Trump has described as unfair trade practices, including the theft of intellectual property, cyber theft, and an increasing trade deficit. As the world's second largest economy, China cannot be satisfied with the exports of low value-added and high-energy products. Therefore, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang issued Strategic Plan Made in China 2025. The goal is by 2025, China will compete with traditional manufacturing powers such as the United States, Japan, and Germany for high-end market share. The United States government believes that Made in China 2025 competes with the United States and that the United States cannot allow China to lead in these areas because it involves the United States' national and military security. Other potential motivations for the trade war are the cultural differences. While China may be willing to compromise with the United States, as the world superpower, especially led by Trump, is less willing to do anything that could stand in the way of a win.
The third section of our presentation on this US-China trade war and the potential trade agreement will be talking about the desired outcomes and the actual outcomes of this trade agreement. So for the desired outcomes, the US and China government officials insist that they are on the same page, according to sources such as Fox News and News 18, stating that there are benefits for both countries and that the deal will contribute to overall trade and peace. So China will be pursuing agreements on certain matters, for example, eliminating tariffs or no more, adding tariffs relating to food and technology products on both sides. More support from the US for Chinese people seeking education and jobs in the United States instead of doubting them as possible spies. They would like more open business transactions between the United States and China, like more cooperation with technology giants such as Huawei, which is currently on the US blacklist called the Entity List, which restricts American firms from selling the company products. So a desired outcome would mostly be a win-win situation where two countries can pursue their mutual interests, but also be optimistic about their differences and more understanding of the relationship between these two countries. The more likely outcomes of this trade deal, according to articles by the New York Times and the Washington Post, this current trade deal, while lifting hopes that tensions between the two countries will ease, is not doing much to solve underlying issues between China and the United States. For example, Eswar Prasad, former head of the International Monetary Fund's China unit, states, "This deal temporarily puts off any further escalations of tensions, but does not resolve any of the major underlying sources of frictions between the two countries or mitigate uncertainty about the future of the bilateral economic relationship." Furthermore, many investors are not confident in the longevity of this trade deal, stating that Trump's statement, "We are near the end of the trade war," is not plausible, and even going so far as to question whether this truce will last to the end of the year.